On the 25th of June 1991, Slovenia and Croatia simultaneously declared independence from Yugoslavia. 2 days later, the Yugoslav People's Army moved into Slovenia. 10 days after that, it withdrew. The 10-day war was over, and Slovenia was free. What followed in Croatia, in Bosnia, in Kosovo, was something entirely different. Years of ethnic cleansing, siege warfare, massacre, and atrocity that killed somewhere between 100 and 140,000 people, displaced millions more, and produced the worst crimes on European soil since the Second World War. The story that most people were told about why this happened is a story about ancient hatreds, about Serbs and Croats and Bosniaks and Slovens and Kosovars who had always hated each other, whose religious and ethnic differences made conflict inevitable, who were held together only by the iron grip of Tito's communism, and who reverted to their natural state of mutual slaughter the moment that grip was released. This story was told by Western politicians who needed to explain why they were not intervening. It was told by journalists who had not been to Yugoslavia before the wars and who were trying to make sense of what they were seeing. It was told, in various forms, by governments on all sides of the conflict, who found it useful to present their own violence as the natural and inevitable response to the violence of others. It is, in its essential structure, false. Not in every detail. The hatreds were real. The violence was real. The ethnic and religious differences that mapped onto the lines of conflict were real. But the idea that they were ancient and inevitable, that Yugoslavia was always going to explode, that the explosion was somehow contained within the nature of the peoples themselves, is a narrative constructed after the fact to explain what happened without examining who caused it and who benefited from it. What they got wrong about the Yugoslav wars is the same thing they get wrong about most catastrophic political events. They locate the cause in the society that experienced the catastrophe rather than in the specific decisions made by specific people in specific circumstances that produced it. The Yugoslav wars were not the product of ancient hatreds finally unleashed. They were the product of an economic crisis, a constitutional crisis, a series of political decisions made by nationalist leaders who understood that ethnicity was the most powerful tool available for mobilizing populations and consolidating power, and a set of responses by external powers: Germany, the United States, the European Community, the IMF, that accelerated and deepened the crisis rather than managing it. To understand the real origin of the Yugoslav wars, you have to begin not in 1991, but in 1974, and not with ethnicity, but with economics. Yugoslavia in 1974 adopted a new constitution, the most decentralizing constitution in the socialist world, which gave the 6 republics and 2 autonomous provinces of Yugoslavia extraordinary powers over their own economic affairs, while maintaining a rotating collective presidency designed to prevent any single republic or leader from dominating the federal state. Tito, who had held Yugoslavia together through the sheer force of his personal authority and his Communist Party's monopoly on power since 1945, was 72 years old, and the 1974 Constitution was his attempt to design a system that could function after his death. It was, by almost any measure, a constitutional disaster. The 1974 Constitution created a system so decentralized that the federal government was almost incapable of making significant economic decisions without the unanimous agreement of the 8 constituent units. This was manageable in the prosperous 1970s, when Yugoslav living standards were rising, when the country had access to Western credit on favorable terms, and when the legitimacy of the system was not seriously challenged. It became catastrophic in the 1980s when the economic conditions changed. The change came in 1979 and after. Two things happened that transformed Yugoslavia's economic situation. The first was the global oil shock, which increased energy costs for an economy heavily dependent on energy imports. The second, and more consequential, was the sharp rise in international interest rates following the Federal Reserve's decision under Paul Volcker to raise American interest rates dramatically to crush inflation. Yugoslavia, which had borrowed heavily in the 1970s from Western banks at low variable interest rates, suddenly found the cost of servicing its debt rising rapidly. By 1981, Yugoslavia's foreign debt was approximately $20 billion. The interest payments on this debt were consuming an increasing share of federal revenues. The economic miracle of the 1960s and 1970s was over. What followed was a decade of economic deterioration that destroyed the material basis for Yugoslav unity. Inflation accelerated through the 1980s, reaching several 100% by the late 1980s, and hyperinflation over 1,000% by 1989. Unemployment grew. Living standards fell. The youth unemployment rate in some regions reached 40%. The economic bargain that had underpinned Yugoslav communism, the exchange of political conformity for rising living standards, and the freedom to travel and work abroad, collapsed. The IMF, which had become the primary external economic influence on Yugoslavia through its role in managing the debt crisis, imposed structural adjustment programs that required cuts in federal spending, wage restraint, and market liberalization. These programs, applied to an economy already experiencing severe stress and a political system incapable of implementing coherent economic policy, produced the predictable results. The economic pain was unevenly distributed. The more developed republics, Slovenia and Croatia, paid more into the federal system than they received. The less developed republics and provinces, Kosovo, Macedonia, Bosnia, received transfers from the federal budget that became increasingly resented by the contributors. This economic geography became the raw material for nationalist mobilization. The argument that Slovenes and Croats were paying to support a system that primarily benefited Serbs, or the argument that Serbs were being discriminated against in Kosovo, or the argument that federal economic management was destroying regional prosperity, all of these arguments became powerful precisely because the economic deterioration was real, and the system was genuinely incapable of managing it equitably. The political crisis began after Tito's death in 1980. The rotating presidency that the 1974 Constitution had created, in which the presidency of Yugoslavia rotated annually among the 8 constituent units, was unable to provide coherent leadership in a crisis. No single figure had Tito's authority. No single institution had the legitimacy to impose the economic sacrifices that the debt crisis required. The Federal Communist Party, the League of Communists of Yugoslavia, was itself increasingly fractured along Republican lines, with the Slovenian and Croatian parties moving toward market liberalism and political pluralism, while the Serbian party remained committed to centralism. Into this vacuum stepped Slobodan Milošević. His rise to power is the pivot point that most accounts of the Yugoslav wars correctly identify as crucial, though they often misidentify why. Milošević was not a Serbian nationalist in any deep ideological sense, when he rose to prominence in the Serbian Communist Party in the mid-1980s. He was a communist apparatchik, a career party man, who understood that nationalism was the political tool that could mobilize the Serbian population in a moment when communist ideology had exhausted its appeal. In April 1987, he visited Kosovo Polje, the field of blackbirds, the site of the mythologized 1389 battle between Serbian forces and the Ottomans that had become the central narrative of Serbian national identity, and encountered a crowd of Serbian Kosovars who felt threatened by the Albanian majority population. The crowd was agitated. Police tried to disperse them. Milosevic intervened with a phrase that was broadcast across Yugoslavia. "You will not be beaten. People should not beat you." This moment, caught on television, replayed endlessly, transformed Milosevic from a communist functionary into the defender of the Serbian nation. He understood what had happened, and he pursued it deliberately. He used control of Serbian media to amplify Serbian nationalist grievances. He manipulated the constitutional process to strip Kosovo and Vojvodina of their autonomous status in 1989, giving Serbia 3 of the 8 votes in the federal presidency and effectively ending the constitutional balance that the 1974 Constitution had established. He organized mass rallies, the anti-bureaucratic revolution, he called it, that overthrew governments in Vojvodina and Montenegro and replaced them with loyalists, giving him control of 4 of 8 federal presidency votes. The response to Milosevic's power grab accelerated the dissolution. Slovenia, which had been moving toward multi-party democracy and market reform, held elections in April 1990 and elected a non-communist government committed to Slovenian sovereignty. Croatia held elections in May 1990 and elected Franjo Tuđman and the Croatian Democratic Union, a party whose nationalist symbolism, including the revival of the checkerboard flag associated with the wartime Croatian Ustasha regime, alarmed Serbs in Croatia and gave Milosevic further ammunition for his narrative of Serbian endangerment. Tuđman was not Milosevic's mirror image, though he is often presented as one. He was a nationalist, certainly, and his government's treatment of Croatian Serbs, the dismissal of Serbian employees from public sector jobs, the constitutional redefinition of Croatia as a state of the Croatian nation rather than of Croatian citizens, was clumsy and provocative. But Tuđman was not pursuing ethnic cleansing as a policy goal in 1990 and 1991. He was pursuing Croatian independence, and his management of the Serbian minority in Croatia was incompetent rather than exterminatory, at least in the early period. The Serb minority in Croatia, approximately 12% of the population, was manipulated by Milosevic and the Serbian security services into armed rebellion in the summer of 1990. The Serb Democratic Party in Croatia, led by Milan Babić and backed by Belgrade, organized a referendum on Serb autonomy in the Krajina region and began erecting barricades, the so-called log revolution, across Croatian roads. Weapons were distributed to Croatian Serb militias. The Yugoslav People's Army, which was effectively under Serbian control by 1990, began positioning units in areas with significant Serbian populations. The European community, which was deeply involved in trying to manage the crisis, was divided in its response. Germany was the crucial external actor in this period. Chancellor Helmut Kohl and Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher pushed strongly for the recognition of Slovenian and Croatian independence, in part because of German historical and cultural ties to Catholic Slovenia and Croatia, in part because of the logic of German reunification, which had established the principle that peoples had the right to choose their political arrangements, and in part because Germany saw an opportunity to extend its influence in Central Europe. Other European states, particularly France and Britain, were deeply reluctant to recognize Slovenia and Croatia, fearing that recognition, without an agreed framework for minority rights protection, would precipitate the violence they were trying to prevent. This is one of the most consequential and least discussed aspects of the Yugoslav crisis. The German push for early recognition. Germany recognized Slovenia and Croatia unilaterally in December 1991, forcing the rest of the European community to follow in January 1992, occurred before any agreed framework for minority rights, before the status of the Serb minority in Croatia had been secured, before Bosnia had been consulted about how recognition of Croatian independence affected its own position, and before the war in Croatia had ended. The recognition did not cause the war. The war had already begun. But it foreclosed certain diplomatic options and accelerated the timeline in ways that made the subsequent conflict in Bosnia more likely. Bosnia-Herzegovina was the republic where the constitutional logic of Yugoslav dissolution was most catastrophically applied. Bosnia was the most ethnically mixed republic in Yugoslavia, roughly 44% Bosniak Muslim, 31% Serbian Orthodox, and 17% Croatian Catholic, with none of these communities forming a clear majority. Its capital, Sarajevo, was a genuinely multicultural city where these communities had lived alongside each other, intermarried, and built a shared urban culture for generations. The city had hosted the 1984 Winter Olympics. Its residents had a legitimate pride in what they had built together. The logic of the recognition of Slovenia and Croatia was that if those republics could leave Yugoslavia, Bosnia could too, or would have to, since remaining in a Yugoslavia dominated by Serbia would be intolerable for the Bosniak and Croatian communities. But the logic that applied to Slovenia and Croatia, where one ethnic group constituted a large majority and could plausibly define the political unit as a national state, did not apply to Bosnia. Bosnia had no ethnic majority. Any definition of Bosnia as a nation-state would leave significant ethnic minorities in what felt to them like someone else's country. Alija Izetbegović, the Bosniak leader who became president of Bosnia, declared independence in April 1992, following a referendum that the Bosnian Serb community boycotted. Within days of the independence declaration, Bosnian Serb forces, commanded by General Ratko Mladić and backed by the Yugoslav People's Army under the command of General Blagoje Ajic and ultimately Milosevic, began the siege of Sarajevo. It would last for 44 months, making it the longest siege of a capital city in the history of modern warfare. More than 10,000 civilians were killed. The city was shelled and sniped systematically, with civilian targets including markets, hospitals, and water supply infrastructure being deliberately targeted. The international response to the siege of Sarajevo and the war in Bosnia combined the worst features of humanitarian intervention and non-intervention. The United Nations deployed peacekeepers, UNPROFOR, who were mandated to protect humanitarian aid convoys but not to protect civilians, who watched ethnic cleansing occur and were ordered not to intervene, who were taken hostage by Bosnian Serb forces when NATO threatened airstrikes, and who became, in the most critical analysis, instruments of a policy of managed atrocity in which the Western powers provided enough humanitarian assistance to reduce the political pressure for genuine intervention while doing nothing to stop the killing. The Srebrenica massacre of July 1995 was the event that finally broke this paralysis. Srebrenica had been declared a United Nations safe area in 1993. When Bosnian Serb forces under Mladic overran the enclave in July 1995, approximately 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were taken out and executed. The executions were organized systematically over several days. The Dutch UN peacekeepers in Srebrenica were disarmed and watched. The commander of UN forces, the French General Bernard Janvier, had weeks earlier declined to approve NATO airstrikes against Bosnian Serb forces that had attacked other UN safe areas in exchange for the release of UN hostages. The Srebrenica massacre, combined with Bosnian Serb shelling of a Sarajevo marketplace that killed 37 civilians in August 1995, finally produced the NATO military response, Operation Deliberate Force, that changed the military balance. Croatian and Bosnian government forces, coordinating in operations that the United States facilitated, launched major offensives that recovered significant territory. The Dayton Agreement, signed in November 1995, ended the war in Bosnia by essentially partitioning the country into two entities, along lines broadly corresponding to the positions of the armies when the ceasefire was agreed. Kosovo came last. The Albanian majority in Kosovo, approximately 90% of the population, had lost their autonomous status when Milosevic stripped it in 1989. Through the 1990s, under Ibrahim Rugova's leadership, the Kosovo Albanians had pursued a strategy of nonviolent resistance, building parallel institutions, schools, clinics, taxation systems, while refusing to participate in the Serbian state that they regarded as occupying their territory. This strategy was praised internationally, but produced nothing. The Dayton Agreement, which ended the Bosnian War, did not address Kosovo. Rugova's nonviolent strategy was effectively abandoned by a significant part of the Albanian population, who concluded that violence had achieved for the Bosnians what nonviolence had failed to achieve for Kosovo Albanians. The Kosovo Liberation Army emerged in the mid-1990s as a guerrilla organization attacking Serbian security forces. Milosevic's response was a counter-insurgency campaign that targeted not just the KLA but the Albanian civilian population. Village burnings, massacres, mass displacement. By early 1999, several 100,000 Kosovo Albanians had been internally displaced. The Rambouillet negotiations in February and March 1999, at which the United States presented terms requiring a NATO peacekeeping force with access to all of Yugoslavia, terms that Serbia could not accept, broke down. NATO launched a 78-day bombing campaign against Serbia and Serb forces in Kosovo. Serbian forces accelerated the expulsion of Kosovo Albanians during the bombing, with approximately 850,000 people fleeing or being expelled in 10 weeks. The bombing achieved its immediate military goal. Serbian forces withdrew from Kosovo. A UN administration was established. Kosovo declared independence in 2008, recognized by most Western states but not by Russia, China, or Serbia. What they got wrong about the Yugoslav wars is not primarily the description of what happened. The massacres, the ethnic cleansing, the siege of Sarajevo, the Srebrenica genocide, these are documented with extraordinary precision. What they got wrong is the explanation. The ancient hatreds thesis is not just historically inaccurate, it is politically convenient for those who failed to prevent the atrocities, because it implies that prevention was impossible. If these people were always going to kill each other, there was nothing the international community could have done. The record shows differently. The economic crisis of the 1980s could have been managed differently. The IMF programs that squeezed Yugoslavia's economy while offering no political framework for distributing the pain equitably contributed to the conditions that nationalist politicians exploited. The German recognition of Slovenia and Croatia in December 1991, over the objections of other European partners, and without an agreed framework for minority protection, accelerated a timeline that made the Bosnian War more likely. The UN mandate in Bosnia that prohibited peacekeepers from protecting civilians while placing them close enough to the atrocities to absorb political pressure was a deliberate choice that enabled ethnic cleansing to continue for 3 years before Srebrenica finally forced a response. The Dayton Agreement that ended the Bosnian War created a state so dysfunctional, divided between two entities with veto powers over each other, and a tripartite presidency designed for permanent deadlock, that it has been unable to make significant political or economic progress for nearly 3 decades. What produced the Yugoslav wars was not ancient hatred. It was a specific economic crisis, specific constitutional failures, specific political decisions made by nationalist leaders who chose ethnicity as their tool for political survival, and specific failures of international management that allowed those leaders to pursue violence without sufficient cost. The ancient hatred story is a story that benefits those who failed to prevent the catastrophe by making prevention seem impossible. The actual history of economic crisis, political manipulation, and international failure is a story about choices and about who made them. If this story changed the way you think about ethnic conflict and its real causes, subscribe. Every week we go deep on the decisions that shaped the world, the economic forces that create the conditions for political violence, the institutional failures that allow it to continue, the historical narratives constructed after the fact to explain away responsibility. Drop a comment below on whether you think the Yugoslav wars could have been prevented. I read every one. I'll see you in the next one.